D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, forever needed to be recognized as an event of truly global magnitude, one of the really big ones. When United Allied forces hit the beaches of northern France en masse at the start of a big push against the German forces that had threatened and then acted against the best rule of law and democracy the world had come up with to that time. But now we are fast losing the survivors and witnesses in 2026. 82 years later, the last of those heroes and observers are well into their 90s and 100s. It is estimated that only 31,000 World War II veterans in total remain alive in the USA, fewer than 8,000 in the United Kingdom, and of course a much lower body count for the D-Day survivors, just a few thousand worldwide, and in fact less than 100 in the UK, which makes their testimonies on film of greater value and significance, and frankly, the work of preservation by documentary makers, me included, of greater importance than when I started presenting war history programs about 40 years ago now. In my 68th year, with a significant archive, I truly feel a greater responsibility than all the years before, but maybe that is because I can also see the end of my perch these days. There are 3 titles presented here in this 3-hour binge watch. It includes 1-minute comfort breaks between each video in support of those like me who need to find a dunny more often than we used to, or to just get another favourite bevy and stack up the biscuits plate. The first title is a 30-year-old production, Britain at War, D-Day Landings. I didn't produce this, but I have bought a lot of titles over the years in order to support the preservation and presentation of these unique works. Second video is one of mine, D-Day, the Normandy Invasion. I had a lot of fun filming a Spitfire for this, they move quick. And lastly, to complete this pack, D-Day Beaches, Then and Now, again presented by me, but this is where, in addition to the archive used, I travelled to the locations in France from the beaches to the cemeteries, a moving experience filled with sadness, ghosts, and a surprising number of weeping vets when I made this about 25 years ago. I suspect most of those I met are now no longer with us. I hope this work pleases you and supports the eternal message, lest we forget. Slanch Liam Dale.
From the start of the war until 1944, the Nazi war machine had occupied much of Europe. But on the 6th of June, the Allies finally launched their campaign to liberate the continent.
This is it. I mean, this is the thing that you train for, this is what you're going to do, and it was quite keen.
The D-Day landing saw the largest amphibious assault in history in an effort to gain a toehold in Nazi-occupied France.
You could have walked from the Isle of Wight across to France without getting your feet wet. You felt so great.
Rocket ships fired 200 rockets in one go, I think. Other sorts of little warships are flying around, all firing.
If the German troops were able to prevent the initial landings, the campaign to liberate Western Europe would fail and German occupation would continue.
The first wave had already gone in and been slaughtered. As soon as you dropped the ramp, they were hitting us.
You knew that once you got in sight of that beach, you were going to lose a lot of men. All young men too.
This is the story of the men who fought and died for freedom in the climactic battle of World War II. The Allies had seriously underestimated the strength of the German forces at the start of World War II. Nazi equipment, transport and firepower was far superior to much of their own outdated armory. As the Blitzkrieg onslaught spread into France, the retreating British Expeditionary Force were effectively cut off from nearly all of the escape routes to the English Channel. A desperate rescue operation from the beaches of Dunkirk evacuated some 338,000 soldiers back to the UK. Churchill prepared Britain for a Nazi invasion.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
From the start of the war up to D-Day, it gradually got worse for supplies, for food. The bombing at different places. I did 2 or 3 jobs in London. The things that I used to hate more than anything was the doodlebugs, the V2s. They were the one bomb that they had was very demoralizing. I suppose really the V1 was a laugh because you could hear them coming and then you'd hear them put put put. The engine would stop and then you used to take bets on where it was going to land.
Once the threat of Nazi invasion had receded, Churchill knew an overall victory would only be possible if the Allies once again crossed the English Channel and got a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe. But with many British troops deployed overseas in various theatres of war, new soldiers were needed.
The main British Army, of course, was out in either the Far East or in North Africa, going into Italy, you see. They had to make really a fresh army, a new army, which is what the 18-year-old conscript of 1942 made.
There were very few of my unit or of the brigade who'd actually, shall we say, been to war. We were all green, and I think, in a way, ignorance is bliss. You know, it might sound stupid, but as a young man, it's a bit of a game.
I didn't wait to be called up. They lowered the recruiting age, and in November 1942, I was 17 and a quarter, which they lowered out, so I volunteered then. But basically, it was what we did. In those days, we volunteered to fight for our country.
From 1940 to 1944, the British Army had doubled in size to 1.5 million men. Training this huge and complex force for the invasion would take many months. Towns had civilians evacuated for the soldiers as acres of land turned into military camps.
We went up to Inverary in Scotland, and we'd had done an assault across the lake. They'd rigged the scramble nets up, which we had to go from the big ship into the small ship. And actually we lost 3 men. They fell over the side and got drowned.
We spent a lot of time attacking a gun battery, which was rigged up. And there was loads and loads of field firing exercises where we used live ammunition. We also spent a lot of time assaulting pillboxes and things like that, and laying minefields.
I can remember a sergeant giving a lecture on mines, and he had a mine which exploded whilst he was trying to defuse it, and his body was wheeled around the camp so as to let the troops know exactly what happened when a mine exploded.
In 1941, the war took a dramatic turn. In June, Germany turned on its former ally and invaded the USSR. And then in December, Japan attacked the American naval base in Pearl Harbor. Churchill was now joined by Stalin and Roosevelt in the fight against fascism. But the Allied leaders couldn't agree on what strategy would lead them to victory.
We had the broadcasts on radio. We only had radio in those days, and we only got what the people told us. Like Stalin was having a moan because we wasn't doing anything on to create a second front, which D-Day was the start of the second front.
The press, the newspapers, were always on about the second front. And we knew we were being trained for something, and we knew with all the build-up of Americans coming into the country, we knew that something was going to happen sooner or later, but we didn't know when. Well, we didn't know if it was France even.
In May 1943, the planned attack on Germany was finally given its name, Operation Overlord. The American Dwight D. Eisenhower was chosen as Supreme Commander. Masses of US soldiers arrived in Britain in preparation for the invasion of Northwest Europe.
The saying was, over here, overpaid and oversexed. They were a nuisance.
I don't think the British soldier was pleased to see the Americans, for the simple reason that they were paid much better than us. And more importantly still, they got the girls, and we didn't. And that didn't go down well.
From the outset, planning for Operation Overlord focused on where best to penetrate the German coastal defences. Stretching from northern Norway to the Franco-Spanish frontier, these defences were known as the Atlantic Wall. Whilst Calais in France offered the shortest distance for the Allies to travel, it was also one of the most heavily defended ports. Despite this, many in the Army Command wanted to land here. However, Normandy was chosen because the beaches were fairly close to English ports and well within range of Allied aircraft stationed in the UK. The Allies knew that their attack was not going to be a surprise, but to give themselves the best chance of success, they launched Operation Fortitude, a plan of deception to make the Germans think they would be landing in Calais.
What the British military did, and which is a very good idea really, was to build rubber dummies, rubber tanks, replicas only made out of all sorts of things, and put them in fields in near enough the whole of Kent, round the back of Dover, Canterbury, and all down there. There were acres and acres and acres of them. And from the sea and from the air, it looked as though there were masses of soldiers being massed in this particular area, because we wanted them to think that we were going to land in the part of Calais.
By the spring of 1944, the Allies were ready to make their assault. The plan was to ferry 160,000 men to the beaches of Normandy, whilst nearly 10,000 paratroopers would jump behind enemy lines. To transport the troops, the Navy and Merchant Navy made available 195,000 men and 5,000 ships. It was to be the largest and most impressive armada ever assembled. British General Bernard Montgomery, who had successfully defeated the Germans in the North African desert, was put in charge of land operations.
We had great faith in Montgomery. He was that sort of general. He served in the First World War, and he wouldn't do an attack unless he had the stuff. So we knew that we were going to be supported every time he'd done something. He wasn't a rash general trying to make his name.
Oh, I like Monty. Monty, you know, hello chaps. And I think the phrase was, forgive it being on tape or the phrase was, he's a little shit, but he's all right. You know, that was the thing. And he was a good general. He great respect for him. You don't follow people you don't trust, you don't believe in.
Montgomery's old adversary from the North African campaign, Erwin Rommel, was assigned to improve the Atlantic Wall's defences. A string of reinforced concrete pillboxes were built along the beaches to house anti-tank guns and light artillery. Minefields were planted on the beaches, and underwater obstacles and mines were placed in waters just offshore. Unlike at the Battle of El Alamein, Rommel was determined the German defence line would hold and that the British would be pushed back into the sea.
He was a good general. He chased us through the desert, didn't he? Till we pushed him back. He was a good general. He was another, what I would call a soldier's general.
It's not often you hear the enemy talk about one of the enemy's officers, but Rommel, when he wasn't in the desert, he used to go around and visit all these home troops and our troops who were in the hospitals and ask them if they've been treated all right. He was an officer and a gentleman.
Only a few days in each month were suitable for launching Operation Overlord because both a full moon and a low tide were required. The moon to illuminate navigational landmarks for the crews of aircraft, gliders and landing craft, and the low tide to help safe navigation around German defensive obstacles.
The invasion was going to be June the 5th, but a storm blew up and we didn't, they decided it was too risky, so they delayed it for 24 hours. And we was off Spithead in the Isle of Wight, and there was a massive ships there.
The Allied troop convoys already at sea were forced to take shelter in bays and inlets on the south coast of Britain for the night as the storm raged.
We went into a very, very stormy sea, rough sea. Roughly 300 on our boat, and 9 out of 10 of us were seasick. All I wanted to do was to get off that boat. I was so ill, so seasick.
Some, I reckon, were dying. I mean, it took us 2 days to get from a place called Fowey on the big ships, because they transferred them into the landing craft. And some of them were, well, just dying, I reckon.
We were given bromide tablets, but I think the War Department thought they wouldn't be much good to us because they also gave us paper bags marked vomit for the use of. So
The Germans took comfort from the poor conditions and believed no invasion would be possible for several days. Some troops even stood down, and Erwin Rommel took a few days' leave to celebrate his wife's birthday. At a vital meeting on June the 5th, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist forecast a brief improvement in the weather for the following day. Operation Tonga, the first stage of Overlord, was given the green light. 10,000 paratroopers were flown behind enemy lines to disrupt German supply routes and defences in order to minimize the threat to the beach landings.
We took off at about 11:30 on the night of the 5th of June. We were told what our objectives were: to capture the canal bridge over the Caen Canal and the road bridge over the River Orme. They had to be seized and captured intact.
To disrupt Allied airborne landings, the Germans placed 12-foot poles with sharpened tops on potential landing zones, which the troops called Rommel's asparagus. Low-lying river and estuaries were flooded, which made flight navigation extremely difficult, and many men were dropped miles away from their intended landing zones.
Because of the flooded area, the air crews dropped where they could, and they themselves were bemused because of the floods, so they couldn't see the Deves. There was just a great flooded area. Some of them confused the rivers. Some were dropped 20 miles away, literally miles away. I landed and found myself all alone. Now, I should have landed amongst the whole of the 9th and the 1st Canadian Para-Battalion. So there should have been something like 1,200 men around me.
Much of the equipment dropped from the planes was lost in the floods, and many paratroopers struggled landing in the water.
Heavily laden troops If you land in water, and with a parachute landing on top and being under the canopy or mixed up with their rigging lines, and of course some of them could have had a fairly heavy landing and been stunned, there were a number of people listed missing and a number were drowned.
As part of the airborne operation, the Allies used gliders attached to tow planes to land men in Normandy. The Horsa glider could carry up to 25 men and flew into enemy territory low and fast to avoid being picked up on radar. Many were shot down by anti-aircraft guns or crash-landed. The first military action of the campaign happened just after midnight, when 6 Horsa gliders landed within a few feet of a target bridge.
To land the way they did, right on top Pegasus Bridge, was marvellous, marvellous. It certainly took the Germans by surprise. The whole idea, of course, was to capture that bridge and also the one across the adjacent River Orne, so as to stop any German assault coming in from surrounding areas.
The control of Pegasus Bridge enabled the Allies to disrupt any German reinforcements heading to the beaches. It also provided a route for advancement if the beach landings were successful and Allied ground forces pushed inland. On the 6th of June, with a break in the weather, the assembled armada set sail for the invasion of the Normandy coast.
It did ease down the weather, and next thing he said, right, we go, and that's what happened. And you could have walked from the Isle of Wight across to France without getting your feet wet. And the aircraft were about 30 or 40 feet above the sea. It was it felt so great.
This was it. I mean, this is the thing that you train for, this is what you're going to do. And it was quite keen. Some of the lads were quite keen, you know. We've never been in action before, so we didn't know what it was like. And I think if we knew what it was like, we wouldn't have been so keen.
I wasn't nervous or afraid. I was very apprehensive as to what was going to happen to me. Would I see my parents again? Would I see my girlfriend, who later became my wife? Would I see her again? But in the end, I found myself a camouflage netting, lay down on that and went to sleep.
The vast aerial power of the Allies ensured their armada was free from a German air attack. The whole fleet was spearheaded by 287 minesweepers that cleared the way for the other vessels. Behind them, 138 warships bombarded the German beach defences in Normandy itself.
We were allowed out on deck as the sea abated, and we were watching what we could see. And we could see smoke and little matchstick men running about, sort of thing. And we didn't want to go there, you know, sort of thing. But and then we were called back, and another lot came up on to get some air, quite frankly. It's a pretty horrible journey.
As you look towards the shore, it's covered in smoke, and you think, well, is that where we're going to go? What's happening there? In the middle of all that smoke, you see, the flashes of the shells exploding, and things like that. You think, well, must be all right. By the time we get there, all that would have gone on a bit further. The guns would have opened up their range and firing beyond that.
When I hear of Navy gunners, they were fairly accurate. What they fired for, they hit. Over the top of that was destroyers going round, and they signalled to one another, whoop, 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 going round like they were floating, going round quite fast, some of them. Rocket ships fired 200 rockets in one go on them. Other sorts of little warships are flying around, and all were firing. Planes going over the top, strafing, it was all exploding. They really had a go at that beach, I tell you. I wonder whether anything left of it.
Despite the fact that the warships and the RAF were throwing everything they could at the German Atlantic Wall, the defences were holding and firing back at the approaching forces.
They were getting the range, these 88s were coming out at us, and they were knocking, they were absolutely first-class guns. I mean, what they were meant for really was aircraft, but they found they were so good at knocking things out, these 88s, that they concentrated on the landing craft.
Over 4,000 landing craft of differing types and sizes were loaded up with troops ready to invade the beaches.
We went to the mothership and they loaded the troops down the scramble nets into the landing craft. Many a time some couldn't hold on, and the weight of the gear used to fall into between the landing craft and also the mothership. And you never see them no more.
It was a bit tidal, you know, and you get some off, and the landing craft to come up, and then all of a sudden a wave would take you and it pushed them into the water, you know, hit them before they could move. And some of them got drowned like that.
We were given waterproofs, but apparently it quickly came down, I suppose it happened to others, that they were full of air. So the order come round, and apparently a lot of blokes were safer just stabbing them with a bayonet, taking a bayonet and cutting them with a bayonet, because they're full of air, and when you come off the boat, your legs fill up and in the event you were drowned.
Well, you were pushing your way through dead bodies. I mean, say, you get one sticking out the water, you'd be going over the top of one or something like that. And then you had the Belgian gates, which were meant, where they cross like that. They were meant to rip the bottom of the landing crafts out, which they did do.
The Germans were expecting any landing to happen during a high tide, when in fact the Allies had planned for a low tide assault, to enable easier navigation through the Belgian gates and mines. However, the big disadvantage caused by a low tide was the beaches were now much longer. Troops had much more ground to cover before they could reach safety.
As soon as you dropped the ramp, they were hitting us, just slaughtering them. All along the top, there were 65 separate machine gun pits. And if you put your hand up like that, they'd have it. They were so good. They were so good. The machinery and the guns they had were so... I think they were far superior to what we had.
You knew that once you got in sight of that beach, you were going to lose a lot of men. We didn't lose as many as we thought we were going to lose, but we lost enough. All young men too. 18, 19, 20.
In order to protect their troops, the Allies had a host of tanks specially modified for the invasion, dubbed Hobart's Funnies after Percy Hobart, an armoured war expert who developed them. The DD Shermans were amphibious swimming tanks. Launched around 2 miles offshore, they could make their own way to the beaches to support the infantry. To clear a path through the minefields on the beaches, the Crab tank had a rotating steel flail on its front that destroyed mines it crossed. The bobbin carried 10 foot of canvas reinforced with steel, which was laid as a path so that tanks and other vehicles following would not sink into the sandy beaches. The Crocodile was a Churchill tank that had been given a flamethrower instead of a cannon. The flames could be fired over 120 feet and proved effective in clearing bunkers and striking fear into the enemy. Hobart's Funnies were a successful addition to the British landing troops, but German defences around the Atlantic Wall remained effective.
You think with some lads, I mean, they did Italy, Sicily, and went right through without a scratch to do all those 3 landings, went right through a scratch to Germany. Others lads, like me, had never been in action before, virtually didn't get off the boat.
We were firing at them, keeping their heads down, but you're bound to lose some. He'd been preparing them positions for 4 years. Since he knocked us out of France, he'd been preparing.
Rommel believed that the improvements he had made to the Atlantic Wall would have to halt the invasion on the beach and push the Allies back into the English Channel, or Germany would lose the war. It was the job of the airborne forces to take out machine gun emplacements along the wall and destroy the bridges that would prevent the Germans from reinforcing their defences.
9th Battalion were to capture the gun battery at Merville, which thought to be a threat to the invading troops, the beach landings. And the squadron was to blow 5 bridges over the River Deves.
By taking out the bridges, the Allies would prevent the easy arrival of German supplies and reinforcements to the beaches, and so gain a crucial advantage.
We reached the bridge and there was a few Canadian soldiers because the Canadians were giving us protection. They were to fan out to give us cover whilst we destroyed the bridge. Having completed that, on the way back, a German jeep pulled up with 4 Germans in it and mistaken the Canadians for German troops. I started asking questions, and when they realised their mistake, they attempted to drive away, and of course the Canadians riddled them and the vehicle was undrivable. And we had to pass by them, and I remember passing. They were the first dead Germans I saw.
Of the 700 paratroopers committed to taking the Merville battery, only 150 men were ready to attack. The rest were lost in the countryside, wounded or had drowned in the marshes. Lieutenant Colonel Ottaway, who was in charge of the mission, decided the target was too important to abandon.
Merville Battery was Ottaway's lot, and they all landed in the wrong place, and he took that battery and silenced those guns, although the Germans retook it, but he silenced those guns, and which was a good thing, because otherwise his guns would have fired upon Sword Beach and made it even worse than it was.
The Normandy coastline chosen for the invasion consisted of 5 beaches which were split between the Allies. The 2 British beaches, codenamed Sword and Gold, the 2 American beaches, Utah and Omaha, and the Canadian beach, Juno.
I landed with the 3rd Canadian Division on Juno Beach. The Royal Engineers had been at work there and had opened up a bit of the promenade for the guns and the lorries and all that sort of thing to get up onto the prom and onto the roadway beyond the promenade. There's countless bodies on that beach, mainly from the French-Canadian unit that came in alongside of us. The regiment de la Chandelle. They lost quite a lot of men there. Mind you, we didn't stop to count them or anything like that, but they were there.
Each beachhead had to be secured and then all linked up to allow for easier reinforcements of troops, equipment and fuel. In the American sector, the landing at Utah Beach, despite occurring slightly south of the target area, proceeded according to plan, as the US 4th Division advanced rapidly inland with few casualties. Omaha Beach, however, turned into an open killing field. German gun emplacements had been well placed and tore into the American soldiers as they left the landing craft. Ships carrying tanks sank, leaving the surviving troops with little cover. The sprint across the beach to safety proved fatal for many.
It was a slow progress going across there, but we arrived off Omaha Beach early hours and when it was getting just light, and the first wave had already gone in and been slaughtered.
They kept landing there, first wave, second wave, third wave onto the beach, knowing full well that the first wave hadn't got off the beach, and it's only a tiny beach really, from the promenade to the sea itself.
Coming under heavy fire, the engineers set about their task of clearing gaps through the beach obstacles, work made more difficult by loss of equipment. They also suffered heavy casualties as enemy fire set off the explosives they were working with. The resulting chaos made easy targets for German gunners.
They kept bunging men on the beach with nowhere to go. And whereas us at Gold Beach, they'd laid us on the beach like their boys laid at Omaha. They couldn't get off the beach. Just would have been mowed down. And I think the British way of fighting was a little bit more sensible. And I think the Americans were badly led.
The British sector proceeded more smoothly. Despite rough seas and higher than expected tides, which hindered the clearance of beach obstacles, excellent naval gunfire support kept German defensive fire suppressed at Sword Beach. On Gold, the obstacles were more numerous than expected, and many landing craft were lost. This hindered the build-up of forces on the beach, but most of the German strongpoints had been nullified by shore bombardment earlier in the morning. The British still suffered 400 casualties while securing the beachhead.
The hard thing for us was when we're going up the beach, our mate gets hit alongside us. We were told on no occasion were we to stop and help anybody. People that come along behind would do that. And it was very hard to see your mate go down and not being able to help him. But as I was getting off the landing craft, I see the blood running onto the sand, and I realised I'd been hit. But going up the beach, I got a shot through the chest, bullet through the chest. And next thing I remember, getting up to the top of the beach, and I must have passed out. I remember no more about D-Day until I was being picked up by the stretcher bearers.
The Allied fatalities for D-Day have been estimated at 2,500, along with 10,000 casualties. The British total was roughly 1,000 on Gold Beach and the same number on Sword Beach. The remainder of the British losses were amongst the airborne troops. Some 600 were killed or wounded, and 600 more were missing. The total German casualties are estimated as being between 4,000 and 9,000 men.
The majority of the German soldier, he was just like me. When I first see one of the dead Germans, I looked at him and I thought, so he ain't no different to me. He's got a mother and father. And you could see, I mean, you'd see a German medical chap tending to one of ours and vice versa. You look up the road or look up the cliffs and there, you can see them still killing each other. Absolutely ridiculous when you look at it that way, you know. Why are we doing it? I mean, they all got mothers and fathers, and you could hear them saying that, Mum, 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 and you couldn't do nothing for them.
I feel so sorry for their parents and that. We always think when we look at the grave there's some mother's son there or some husband there. It's a very hard thing to do.
By the end of D-Day, 150,000 Allied men had managed to land in Normandy. In spite of this considerable success, the Allies had to swiftly stabilize the beachheads and then conduct breakout operations if they were to take full advantage of the invasion. The build-up of adequate supplies was therefore crucial to Allied aspirations.
What really made the D-Day thing was a success was the fact that Hitler had decided we can't take do a landing without we got a port to get supplies in quickly. But he didn't know about the Mulberry Harbour.
One of the greatest difficulties of the opening of the second front was that of supply. The enormous problem of supplying and reinforcing our men through inadequate harbours was one that had to be overcome. And it was overcome, as we all know. Huge prefabricated harbours solved the problem, each providing accommodation equal to Dover. These pictures, taken as the huge armada of ships and harbour installations prepared to set out, give some idea of the size of the undertaking. What a target for submarines and the Luftwaffe, if they'd been able to get to grips.
Mulberry was a funny sort of thing. It looked like a big box made out of concrete, built in sections, and the concrete floated. Daft, innit? Connect them together, you got a pier head.
The next job was the construction of the piers. This consisted of a steel roadway built on a number of bridge sections with flexible joints between to allow for the rise and fall of the tide. The sections were mounted on pontoons of steel or concrete designed to rest on the seabed when the water receded. The piers give direct access to the shore for unloading even the heaviest equipment.
What we done on the British sector, on Gold Beach, they took some old block ships over that were no good anymore and sunk them to stop the full weight of the tide on the harbour. And it worked. But they didn't do that on the American sector, where they were also putting up a harbour, and a storm blew up and completely wrecked the one at Omaha. But ours had survived, but got damaged, and I think they towed part of the damaged portions from Omaha and repaired the British one. I went back 7 weeks later, and I landed on the Mulberry Harbour, and it was much easier than the first time.
In the months following D-Day, the British Mulberry Harbour was used to land over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles and 4 million tons of supplies, providing much-needed reinforcements. The Allies needed a huge amount of fuel to keep the army advancing through France. To overcome the problem of getting oil from Britain, a major engineering project was put in place to send a pipeline across the English Channel.
The pipeline was one of the finest things ever invented for the Second World War. Of the way in which they were going to get fuel, how could they do it? Well, we hadn't got satellites and things like that in those days, so the only thing they could do was under the ocean.
Operation Pluto is another of those top secrets which can only now be revealed. Engineers devised a kind of pipe called Hamel pipe, which made in 20-foot pieces could be welded into any required length. This pipe was so flexible that it could be wound on a drum like cotton on a reel. A plan developed whereby the full length of pipe required to cross the channel could be taken over and laid in one continuous piece. This was in fact done by means of floating drums known as HMS conundrums, or canuns for short. The canun is 90 foot long and over 50 foot in diameter. When fully wound, it weighs 1,600 tons, about the weight of a destroyer, and can carry 70 miles of pipeline.
Crucial to the success of Pluto was the capture of Port-en-Bessin, which was heroically taken by a small force of Royal Marine commandos.
Quite a few boats were hit. The survivors swam ashore, picked up the weapons from the wounded and the killed, and marched, fighting all the way to Port-en-Bessin, 12 odd miles away. And overnighted outside against next day fought a far superior German force and took it. They sailed in a tanker and connected the oil pipe to the tanker and pumped the oil into the tanker. There was no refinery ashore, and they offloaded it onto that particular way. But without oil, the tanks would have grounded to a halt, our tanks. So it was a very important thing.
With Port-en-Bessin in British hands, along with the American-held Cherbourg, oil soon started pumping to the Allies from the English coast and the Isle of Wight. To prevent a German attack, the pumps were hidden in disguised buildings. Although the beaches had been secured, the battle for Normandy was far from over. As the Allied soldiers pushed inland, fierce fighting ensued as the Germans battled to keep hold of strategic territories.
My God, did we fight. They're saying that we took casualties as heavy as the Somme at times. And we did lose a lot of blokes. Hill 112, which thank God I didn't fight on, the 43rd Wessex fought there, and they lost, whole platoons are disappearing. It's not the highest point in Normandy, but they say, the Germans actually said it, whoever controls Hill 112 controls Normandy. They called it the British Omaha. Really fierce fighting went on there. Whole platoons were disappeared, never found them again.
In 2 days' fighting alone, the Allies suffered more than 2,000 casualties. The slopes of the hill were ablaze with the wrecks of British tanks knocked out by the SS Panzer units in occupation of the high ground. Much of Normandy was made up of small fields, high hedgerows and sunken lanes. This slowed down the advancing Allies and enabled the Germans to set up hidden artillery and infantry defences. It was tailor-made for ambushes.
Once I was with the section and we fought hand to hand with some Germans, and that was pretty horrible. This young German soldier, about my age, I was 19 by then. He stepped out this hedge and I killed him. And I sat on the ground and cried and was sick. I killed a human being. And that was terrible. I've got talking to you now, I can see that young, ginger-headed German soldier. Some other son. Some other son.
The balance of military capability in Normandy favoured the Allies. However, experienced German soldiers made great use of limited equipment and positional advantages to frustrate any British advances. The strategically important city of Caen became a thorn in the Allies' side.
Caen was situated at the centre of the roads which led to Paris, to Bayeux, in fact to all other parts of France, really. And it was essential, being a major city, a major junction, railway junction as well, that it came into Allied hands as soon as possible.
It was expected that Caen would fall into Allied hands shortly after the breakout from the beaches. Things did not go quite to plan. Rommel's army divisions had built up strong defences around the city.
Caen wasn't captured, and it should have been captured on D-Day. They tried to capture Caen coming around from the east, and they came through our lines. We know that was an absolute fiasco because it came to nothing. 3 or 4 days after the attack started, we had a lot of rain, but we know that the Germans completely outgunned our tanks. Their 88 was an incredible gun, and it could be used anti-aircraft, anti-tank, anti-personnel.
The hardest thing which I could not do was German tanks as well as our tanks. They blew up, or burned, we called it blown up. In fact, the Germans and some of our boys called the Shermans Tommy Cookers or Ronsons, because they Ronson because they lit at the first flame or something. Flew got first hit, something like that, and they would burn up. And because the boys would be trapped inside, you couldn't get them out. The heat was so fierce. But our officer could pull a pin out grenade and chuck it in the tank. I couldn't do that. Put them out in the misery virtually.
The SS soldiers defending the city, most of whom had graduated from the Hitler Youth, had a fierce loyalty to their Führer and took great honour from fighting to the death for the Nazi cause. Many of the Allies thought this fanatical and wanted to keep their own casualties down to a minimum.
The SS, Hitler Youth, they were nasty individuals. Politics. They were animals, for want of a better word. And the story I tell was the Canadians on Juno Beach, 12th SS and Hitler Youth they were fighting. And I think D3, they captured 30 Canadians, took them in the schoolyard and shot them in the back of the head one by one. The Canadians never ever took an SS prisoner afterwards, right to the end of the war. The moral of that is don't upset a Canadian, for God's sake. We came across a little village once, or small town, and they caught some French, terrorists they were probably called by the Germans. And as they left the town, they set fire to the town, and as we went and shot all the people in it. And as we walked in, hanging from a tree was a very young boy, 5 or 6 years old. We wanted to go after him, but keep your heads, the order comes through, you really go rushing down there, they'll be waiting for you. So the inclination was right, nasty individuals.
With Caen proving so difficult to seize, The Allied air forces were ordered to send their bombers in to destroy the German units that were putting up such a stern defense of the city.
Masses of bombers, both American bombers and British bombers, came over. They converged on Caen, but after a short while you saw nothing because of the dust, and the whole sky was obliterated out.
It left it in ruins. It left it in ruins, which really made it harder to take, because the Germans, the enemy, they had the obvious hiding places to set up their bases to shoot back at the British and Canadians as they were coming in. You had to ferret each one out individually.
Whilst the bombers were busy in the skies over Caen, Typhoon fighter jets were attacking German forces and artillery on the ground.
Our tanks were outgunned, but the saviour was the Typhoon with its rockets. And the Germans, at one particular day, were up a hill. We had no tanks with us, no armour with us. We got further ahead than probably where we should have been. But which often happened because tanks will overnight, they won't move at night if they can help it. And we used to carry on moving. And coming up this hill was a Tiger and Panthers and infantry. We were a bit scared by that. And suddenly over ahead of us, the back of us, over the top of this hill, come 3 Typhoons. Germans were no cowards, no way, but their tops of them tanks opened and they ran for it. I swear those Typhoons had guided missiles in them, radio guided missiles. They never seemed to miss. They go shh, like that. And they hit this 60-ton tank, a Tiger, and it bounced like a rubber ball and blew up. Fantastic.
On the 17th of July, Erwin Rommel's war ended. He was seriously injured when an RAF fighter strafed his car near Caen. Soon after, Rommel was implicated in an attempted assassination of Hitler, which was to later cost him his life, as he was forced into committing suicide by the Nazi Party. The day after Rommel's injury, Bernard Montgomery launched Operation Goodwood, a large-scale attack to the east of Caen involving British and Canadian forces. After 2 days of bitter fighting and 4,000 Allied casualties, the city of Caen was taken. The operation was not a complete success in that Montgomery had failed to break out of Normandy, but it had diverted German attention away from the Americans in the west, allowing them to punch their way through to begin the liberation of France.
You go to Normandy now and you see roads named after American generals and all that sort of thing. And I've only seen one road named after an Englishman, and that was Montgomery Way. But even in Caen, they got an Eisenhower Way, but Eisenhower never went to Caen. But there it is, he's got a road named after him there.
If you look at any D-Day advert today, who was the first thing you see there on the covers? Americans. Americans. I got nothing against the Americans, but why is it all one-sided?
When I think of my friends whose lives were sacrificed that day, I feel very sorry. It brings a tear to my eye. Even today, I feel so sorry for them. And I think to myself, how was it I was so lucky?
Very, very proud and fond memories of the boys that I fought with and didn't come back. We fulfilled the promise we made to them 65 years ago. You won't be forgotten, you will be remembered. And that I find quite emotional at times because they were brothers in arms.
In all the hustle and bustle of modern-day British life, particularly in the country's capital, London, the term D-Day has come to mean anything that is both imminent and of extreme importance. Ask the majority of younger people where the expression comes from, and they'll no doubt tell you that it had something to do with World War II. But ask one of the servicemen or women or folk left behind in Britain to keep the home fires burning, and they'll all tell you the same thing. D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, marked the beginning of the end of World War II, when the French beaches of Normandy were liberated from Nazi occupation by the Allied invasion force. To really appreciate and understand the full implications of D-Day, it does need to be set in context. When armistice came for the soldiers of World War I in 1918, it was hailed as the war to end all wars. But sadly, within just 20 years, the storm clouds of another major global conflict were gathering. When Germany surrendered, the Treaty of Versailles demanded such huge reparation to be paid as a war debt, forcing the German nation to accept sole responsibility for the hostilities. The peace was always going to be an uneasy one. A young Austrian by the name of Adolf Hitler had made something of a reputation for himself fighting for the German army, winning the Iron Cross for valour. But even at this early stage, there were rumours that a medical examination had found him to be psychotic. Hitler's views were horribly anti-Semitic, and he was not alone. With other like-minded ex-soldiers, he entered politics, offering the German nation, by then facing economic disaster, a scapegoat for all of their troubles: the Jews. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazis, with Hitler in control, steadily rose to power as the standard of living for the German people collapsed with mass unemployment and starvation. Germany was banned from having any military capability after World War I, but Hitler flouted the Treaty of Versailles to build a huge army into which the unemployed were conscripted. With uniforms to wear and flags to wave, a sense of restored national pride saw Hitler democratically voted into power with his newly acquired German citizenship. The rest of the world looked on with growing concern as Hitler firstly seized his homeland Austria in 1938 before targeting Czechoslovakia. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, averted war in 1938 by appeasing Hitler, but it was only a postponement of what was sadly inevitable. By September 1939, the peace agreement had been completely violated by Hitler as he'd taken Czechoslovakia and compounded matters by marching into Poland. Great Britain and France had promised to protect Poland, and when the deadline for the Germans to leave had expired at 11 a.m. on Sunday the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and her allies had to face the fact that this time they really were at war with Germany. The early part of the war definitely went Hitler's way as he occupied Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland, and even France. Left alone across the English Channel, the British acquired a new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who incited a wartime spirit in the people of Britain that even Adolf Hitler couldn't destroy. At Dunkirk, the Allies were driven out of France by the advancing Germans, leaving precious vehicles and munitions behind them, lucky to escape with their lives. A remarkable response from the civilians of the south coast of England saw a huge flotilla of tiny craft, including yachts, fishing dinghies, and even rowing boats cross the channel to help bring back the defeated stranded soldiers. Miraculously, over 1/3 men were rescued to fight another day, and in the months and years ahead, they had a very important role to play. Through 1940 and 41, mainland Britain took a considerable bashing from Hitler, as with the Battle of Britain and the Blitz bombs every night, he first tried to invade the island nation, and then, when that didn't work, crush it into submission by fear. With Winston Churchill running the country, neither ploy was successful. Although with mainland Europe occupied by the Nazis, life in Britain was far from comfortable. Then, in December 1941, America entered the war alongside their British allies after the Japanese, who were part of an alliance with Germany known as the Axis powers, bombed the US Navy base at Pearl Harbor. The world was at war against Adolf Hitler, and the battle raged on a global scale. Fighting in the Atlantic, the Pacific, North Africa, Europe, and on the Russian front continued through 1943. But as the new year of 1944 was rung in by Big Ben, the tide that had seemed set fair in Hitler's favour definitely started to turn. Everyone knew that an Allied invasion into northern France was imminent, especially the Germans, but exactly where and when it would come was a matter of conjecture. With the utmost precision, the south coast of England was transformed into a training camp and an enormous embarkation point. Allied troops from all over the world, including the Americans, Canadians, Australians and New Zealanders, joined the British for a combined operation led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, which was codenamed Overlord. Keeping the D-Day landings, as they became known, secret was a matter of the utmost importance, because the element of surprise would be crucial to the invading Allied armies. British counterintelligence really played its part, convincing the Germans that the attack, when it came, would be at the narrowest point across the Channel, between Kent and Calais. In the build-up to D-Day, whenever a reconnaissance flight went over Normandy, two were sent over the Pas-de-Calais, and all German eyes were focused miles away from the beautiful beaches of Normandy that would all too soon be awash with blood. Then, just weeks before the invasion plans were about to be put into action, the British Secret Service spotted a worrying run of answers in the Daily Telegraph crossword that triggered a full-scale alert. Connected with the D-Day landings, there were a number of code words, which were supposed to be top secret. As already mentioned, the whole operation was Overlord. But the various target landing beaches also had code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. alarm bells started ringing firstly when the word Utah appeared, quickly followed by Omaha. It was certainly a strange coincidence. Then the word Overlord cropped up, and when Mulberry appeared, the code for the artificial harbours that the Allies were planning to build at 2 of the landing beaches, British intelligence became very concerned. To compound matters, on the 2nd of June, the word Neptune appeared, which was the code for the entire naval involvement in Operation Overlord. The compiler of the crosswords, an English teacher, was paid a visit by MI5, much to his surprise and horror, as he had no idea what the words meant. The whole incident was certainly bizarre, and no explanation found, although there have been plenty of conspiracy theories to surface since. When the date had been selected for D-Day, the state of the tide was very carefully considered, and the choice of the month of June would offer the best possible chance of reasonable weather, but the British are renowned for being preoccupied with the weather, and for very good reason. Quite unexpectedly, in the run-up to D-Day, the weather turned absolutely foul. Gale-force winds and storms that would not have been out of place in the middle of winter lashed the south coast of England. It would, without doubt, make the invasion much harder for the Allies, but it improved the chances of a surprise attack. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was the man charged with resisting the expected Allied invasion, and with his focus locked on Calais, he looked at the weather in the first few days of June and decided that there would be no invasion in such atrocious conditions. Rommel was so sure of this, he returned home to Germany for his wife's birthday party. Not only was he looking in the wrong place, he'd also underestimated the steely resolve of the Allied commanders, an error of judgment that would lead to the ultimate demise of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. Getting word to the French resistance that the D-Day landings were imminent was a tricky business. But on the 1st and 5th of June, the BBC broadcast "The Long Sobs of the Violins of Autumn" and "Wound My Heart with a Monotonous Languor," the agreed messages to herald the invasion. Evidently, this was not such a well-kept secret, as the chief of German intelligence had been given a tip-off to this effect. When the strange words were heard, the Germans dismissed it as preposterous that the British would send such an important communication over the BBC airwaves. The planned date for D-Day had been the 5th of June 1944, but the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was forced to postpone the operation by a day due to the appallingly unseasonable weather. Things didn't look a great deal better for the 6th of June either, and with thousands of troops already aboard ship, Eisenhower had a very difficult decision to make. If the invasion couldn't go ahead on the 6th, it would be at least another fortnight before the conditions stood any chance of being right again for another attempt. Keeping the operation secret for that long, with the south coast of England in suspended animation, would be very difficult, if not completely impossible. Eisenhower showed resolutely why he had been made Commander-in-Chief when he took the decision to put Operation Overlord into action, despite the stormy seas that had to be crossed. The first skirmishes of D-Day, however, involved aircraft rather than shipping. The designated American landing beaches of Utah and Omaha were at the Cherbourg end of the Normandy coastline, and to make way for the landing craft, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions flew on ahead to drop paratroopers to support the attack. Sadly, many of the American airmen were dropped miles off course, and because Rommel had flooded any ground suitable for parachutists to land on, a number of them were drowned. However, the most famous parachute landing of D-Day was in the little French town of Saint-Mère-Église, where Private John Steele got caught on the church spire. For hours he dangled, pretending to be dead, but eventually the Germans captured him. At the other end of the landing beaches, close to Caen, the British 6th Airborne Division made a daring landing in wooden hawser gliders, perfectly on target to take the strategically important Pegasus Bridge. For the French, who'd suffered the German occupation for so long, this was definitely something to celebrate. As the British troops secured Pegasus Bridge, the neighbouring cafe cracked open the champagne, specially dug up from the garden, where it had been hidden from the Germans. The journey across the English Channel was rather more uncomfortable for those aboard ship than it had been for the airborne troops. To organise such a wide range of soldiers to attack a diverse geographical objective had taken a great deal of planning. But, as Winston Churchill so succinctly put it to President Roosevelt, the Normandy invasion was much the greatest thing that they had ever attempted, and how right he was. There was no convenient port for the Allied invasion force to target, although the Utah landing beach was added almost as an afterthought because of its close proximity to Cherbourg. However, the necessity for the large artificial harbours, codenamed mulberries, was still of vital importance. One would be constructed from Omaha Beach in the American sector, and the other from Gold Beach in the British sector. Also, the large troop-carrying ships could only get within a certain distance of the landing beaches. Therefore, it would be necessary for the soldiers, tanks and equipment to be put ashore on LCVPs, which stands for Landing Craft, Vehicle and Personnel. Consequently, after a very rough crossing, the troops had to face climbing down into landing craft on stormy seas to finish their journey into enemy territory. For those who'd managed to get across the channel this far without suffering nausea, the LCVPs would not allow them to keep the contents of their stomachs in place. Swamped by crashing waves and tossed around like corks, some of the men even had to use their helmets to help clear the water from the craft, with the most unlucky needing to endure a 10-mile run from mothership to shore. The state of those who survived the LCVPs was poor, to say the least, as they were soaked, nauseous and very disorientated. It was no way to face an old friend, let alone a deadly enemy. However, if the Allied invasion force was struggling with seasickness, their German counterparts were equally as unsettled by the sight of a vast armada of battleships unexpectedly coming towards them. When news of the airborne attacks had reached the German commanders, they'd delayed any action because Hitler was sleeping and didn't appreciate being wakened. On this occasion, no doubt, he would have preferred to have been disturbed. Still, the Germans were convinced that there was nothing to worry about because of the weather, although, as time ticked on and the invasion fleet came into view, there was no denying the fact that they'd been taken by surprise. Vital hours had been lost, and it was one of the few pieces of good fortune that the cold, wet, seasick Allied servicemen could take heart from. Despite the fact that D-Day veterans are decreasing in number with every passing year, there are a great many people who come to Normandy to visit the landing beaches and the cemeteries between Cherbourg and Caen. Some are relatives of those who took part in this military operation, while others simply want to understand what happened here. Whatever the reasons, this is an amazing trail to follow, and for the purposes of this programme, we'll start in the west at Utah Beach and head eastwards along the coast to Sword Beach. As dawn broke over Utah Beach, 30,000 American troops and 3,500 vehicles were ready and waiting to come ashore. After so much anticipation and a terrible sea crossing, the invasion force was in for a surprise, but this time it was a pleasant one. An error in navigation had brought them onto the beach almost a mile south of their target, and the sector of beach in which they landed was virtually undefended. The beach was flat, the sand dunes low, and enemy gunfire was sporadic. A single German battalion was taken completely by surprise, and as a result, Allied casualties, 197 men and 32 tanks, were far lower than anybody had dared hope for. Not to be confused with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the son of the former President Theodore Roosevelt, was actually in command at Utah. When he was informed of the navigational error, he was philosophical, saying, "We'll start the war from here." For the Americans who arrived on Utah Beach that auspicious morning, it was indeed a very good place to start. Moving on down the Normandy coastline, en route to the next landing beach at Omaha, the 100-metre cliff face at Point de Hoc is a striking view. As D-Day dawned, Allied intelligence believed that there was a huge German gun battery at the summit of the cliff that could target Utah and Omaha beaches. An American Ranger battalion was sent in to destroy the battery, but it was a daring and dangerous enterprise. 225 Rangers landed, but only 90 survived to tell the tale. The Germans had a terrific vantage point and defended their stronghold to the last man. When eventually the Rangers reached the top of the cliff, they realised they'd been fighting for control of an empty crater. The big guns had all been moved further inland, making the 60% casualty rate for the mission a high price to pay. Yet, for the Americans, the worst carnage still awaited them, despite the fact that all seemed quiet as the landing craft approached Omaha Beach. Allied intelligence was again found lacking, as it was believed that there would be little German resistance to the advance, with troops made up with conscripted Russian and Polish prisoners of war. There was an elite German infantry division in Normandy, the 352nd. The Allies were convinced that they were at least 20 miles from Omaha. They could not have been more wrong in their assessment of what the American soldiers would face, because the 352nd German Infantry Division was ready and waiting on the cliff top above the beach. Of all the landing beaches, the terrain at Omaha was the most difficult to cross, with steep bluffs and cliffs which perfectly concealed the defending German army. With the tactical skills that would be expected of well-trained, experienced infantrymen, the Germans held their fire as the soaking wet, seasick Allies put down the ramps of the landing craft, making ready to scramble ashore. It was only then that the German guns started to attack the stranded Americans that were quite literally sitting ducks. This account, recorded by the US War Department's Historical Division, gives a harrowing description of what happened on Omaha Beach on that stormy June morning. Within 10 minutes of the ramps being lowered, A Company had become inert, leaderless and almost incapable of action. Every officer and sergeant had been killed or wounded. It had become a struggle for survival and rescue. The men in the water pushed wounded men ashore ahead of them, and those who reached the sands crawled back into the water, pulling others to land to save them from drowning, in many cases only to see the rescued men wounded again or to be hit themselves. Within 20 minutes of striking the beach, A Company had ceased to be an assault company and had become a forlorn little rescue party bent upon survival and the saving of lives. Omaha was very important because it linked the US and British invasion beaches, but the cost of the landing was very high. The casualty rate was in excess of 5,000 dead, missing or wounded men, yet somehow the survivors forged their way inland to complete with honour the task they'd been entrusted with. As the Americans were facing the full horror of German supremacy on Omaha, the 50th Division of the British Second Army came face to face on Gold Beach with the inferior enemy troops that had been expected at Omaha. However, resistance to the Allies was fierce for a brief time, due in part to the fact that the arrival of the Sherman tanks needed for the advance had been delayed. Unlike the Americans, the British deployed heavy armoured vehicles to clear obstacles and mines, the funnies and flail tanks being prime examples that were very effective indeed. The primary task of the soldiers on Gold Beach was to seize the seaside town of Arromanches and push on inland towards Bayeux, while making contact with the Americans from Omaha and the Canadians on their eastern side at Juneau. By the end of D-Day, the 50th Division, after a shaky start and heavy casualties in the opening moments, rallied extremely well and were at the outskirts of Bayeux by nightfall. The individual heroism and bravery displayed by the men to achieve this was above and beyond the call of duty. This citation for CSM Stanley Hollis of the 6th Battalion, the Green Howards, who was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions on Gold Beach, eloquently sums up the mood of the day. Wherever fighting was heaviest, CSM Hollis appeared, and in the course of a magnificent day's work, he displayed the utmost gallantry, and on 2 separate occasions, his courage and initiative prevented the enemy from holding up the advance at critical stages. It was largely through his heroism and resource that the company's objectives were gained and casualties were not heavier, and by his own bravery, he saved the lives of many of his men. When it comes to archive footage of the D-Day landings, some of the most widely seen pictures were taken at Juneau Beach, where the Canadian forces came ashore. Like their American counterparts at Omaha, the Canadians faced a daunting task, because although there were no elite troops in the vicinity, the firepower was considerable. In the first onslaught, the casualties were heavy, figures reaching up to 50%, but as the day wore on, the Canadians made incredible progress. The 6th Canadian Armoured Regiment were in fact the only Allied forces to meet their D-Day objective, crossing the Caen to Bayeux Highway by the time darkness fell. There was little doubt for the Germans that the invasion had come, and once the initial shock subsided, the Nazi troops were quickly mobilised. The first counterattack of D-Day came from the 21st German Panzer Division, inland between Juno and the next beach, Sword, and over the coming days they proved to be a considerable threat. Yet the Canadians held out against whatever the Germans threw at them as they advanced through the French countryside. The distance between Juno and Sword was relatively short, but conditions were nevertheless very different. The landing area on Sword was very concentrated, and with a swift incoming tide, there was considerable overcrowding. In the bottleneck of men and machinery, the German artillery were able to do significant damage. For the soldiers disembarking from the landing craft, there was nowhere to go but straight into the fray. If ever a morale boost was needed, it was on Sword Beach that June morning. It came in the form of a Scottish piper who launched himself waist-deep into the bloody waters, fully kilted, as he bagpiped the men ashore to the strains of Highland Laddie. Once on the beach, and an obvious target for the Germans, the piper marched up and down Sword, playing on until all of his comrades were off the landing craft. One of the main objectives of the soldiers who landed on Sword was to join up with the paratroopers who'd liberated Pegasus Bridge, and it's said that the same piper played his rousing tunes all the way there. We can only hope that there was still some hidden champagne left at the cafe at Pegasus Bridge when he arrived. For the Allied commanders, D-Day, despite the terrible weather conditions, had proved an overall success. Eisenhower's brave decision to give the go-ahead had been vindicated, and Winston Churchill had probably never been more pleased to be proved wrong when the casualty figure came in at half what he'd predicted. Eisenhower didn't have an easy relationship with either Prime Minister Churchill or the British commander for Operation Overlord, Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery. Monty was fully occupied with the troops coming off the beaches in the British sector, targeting Caen, but Churchill had wanted to actually sail with the D-Day invasion fleet. As Commander-in-Chief, Eisenhower had the unenviable task of telling Churchill that he couldn't go, because losing Churchill would have given the Germans a great prize, and Eisenhower was not prepared to take the risk, particularly as Winston was approaching his 70th birthday. Stubborn to the core, Churchill refused to be put off, and it took all the authority and diplomatic skill of King George VI rather than Eisenhower to stop him. However, what was definitely required at this crucial time was strong leaders who were not afraid to stand up for what they believed in. Understandably, there were going to be tensions between the various Allied commanders. After all, they would not be the right men to be doing the job if they were easily swayed. Despite the personality clashes, of which there were plenty, everybody shared the same objective. The world needed to be set free from the tyranny of Adolf Hitler and the Axis powers, and the early indications from D-Day suggested that victory was now within the Allies' grasp. As the D-Day invasion developed into the Battle for Normandy, the Allies systematically set about achieving their objectives. With the beachhead established, the two artificial mulberry harbours were towed across the English Channel and constructed at Arromanches on Gold Beach and at Omaha to provide the Allies with ports until Cherbourg could be liberated. The remains of the mulberry at Arromanches, affectionately nicknamed Port Winston, in honour of Britain's much-loved Prime Minister, can still be seen to this day, but the one at Omaha did not fare so well. But it wasn't the German army responsible for its destruction. 13 days after D-Day, the weather dealt the Allies another blow when gale force winds smashed the Omaha mulberry to smithereens. Montgomery had optimistically set the British soldiers who landed on Sword Beach the task of reaching Caen by the end of D-Day, but it proved to be too tall an order. Consequently, it became a major objective to take Caen, and Montgomery consistently attacked between D-Day and July the 1st. Caen fell to the Allies on the 7th of July, just over a month later than expected, and the push towards the liberation of France was back on track. To the west, the soldiers that had fought their way off the beaches at Utah and Omaha had a relentless task, making their way through the French countryside, which was littered with ancient banks and incredibly thick hedgerows. Impervious even to tanks, the landscape stalled the progress of the American infantry, and as it also provided perfect cover from which the Germans could attack, there were further casualties. Cherbourg was eventually surrendered to the Allies on the 26th of June 1944. It was yet another unpleasant surprise for Adolf Hitler, as he'd been convinced that his garrison in Cherbourg would hold firm against all comers. Hitler had again miscalculated, and with Cherbourg under Allied control, the days of the Nazi occupation in France were well and truly numbered. The breakout from the Normandy beaches to liberate the French interior was at times slow and very hard fought. By the middle of August, the bulk of the German resistance in the region had been eliminated. The beautiful city of Paris, that had been subjected to Nazi rule for 4 long years, was now in the Allies' sights, and the people of France waited anxiously for its liberation. The situation in France was far from straightforward, because, as Hitler asked, "Is Paris burning?" Eisenhower planned to bypass the city. But the leader of the Free French, Charles de Gaulle, could not accept this, and threatened to withdraw from the Allied cause altogether and dash for Paris himself, which was enough to make Eisenhower listen to what he had to say. De Gaulle knew the state of his capital city, and convinced the Allied commander that Paris could be taken with ease. On the 25th of August, the fight for Paris was over, and de Gaulle addressed the world. Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated. The liberation of Paris was a great achievement, and for the French resistance, who'd fought so hard to undermine the German occupation, it was the very least the Allies could do. The secret nature of the work of the resistance means that there are countless unsung heroes who played their part in the D-Day landings, sabotaging German operations throughout France. Fighting as proudly as the soldiers, sailors and airmen who gave their lives to secure the Normandy beaches, we'll never know exactly how many members of the French resistance made their ultimate sacrifice to make the defeat of Adolf Hitler possible. While Operation Overlord and the subsequent Allied advance towards Germany and Berlin gave Adolf Hitler problems from the west, the Eastern Front and the Russians were also making life very difficult for the German army. Warsaw, the capital of Poland, which had been so fundamental in bringing Britain and France into the conflict with Hitler back in 1939, was wrestled from German control as 350,000 Nazi soldiers were killed, wounded or captured. The Soviet army marched ever westward as the Allies battled their way towards Berlin. Yet for the people of Britain, and Londoners in particular, who'd suffered and survived the Blitz, the German bombers continued to wreak havoc with V-1 and V-2 rockets. A retaliatory Allied bombing raid on Dresden caused equal devastation and took many innocent German lives. Sadly, there were still casualties on both sides as the end of the war came into sight, a very bitter irony after more than 5 long years of World War. On the 21st of April 1945, the Russians reached the German capital, Berlin, quickly followed by the Allies from the west. For Adolf Hitler, the war was lost, and after causing so much anguish, pain and suffering, rather than face the consequences of his actions, he committed suicide. The Nazi hierarchy fell like a house of cards, and Germany surrendered unconditionally on the 7th of May. The victory in Europe was won, and the celebrations began the very next day, known to the world as VE Day. In London, the people filled the streets, and the royal family, joined by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, came onto the balcony at Buckingham Palace to greet the grateful nation. Throughout the country, in towns and villages, people joined together for street parties as children who hadn't even been born when the conflict started celebrated along with the elderly folk who never expected to live long enough to see peace in their time. However, there was one very distinguished elder statesman who didn't get to see VE Day, even though he'd been instrumental in bringing it about. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had been ailing for some time, and he died in April 1945, leaving new President Harry S. Truman to conclude the war in the Pacific. Unfortunately, the Japanese were determined to fight on, and were in no mood to talk peace despite the end of the war in Europe. Consequently, Truman was faced with an appalling dilemma. He could either mount a full-scale invasion of Japan, which would result in massive Allied casualties, or he could use the atomic bomb, which would decisively finish the war, but devastate thousands of innocent Japanese lives. Truman opted for the latter of the two evils, and on the 6th of August 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and on the 14th of August, the Japanese surrendered. The Americans celebrated VJ, Victory Over Japan Day, and the world could rest a little easier as the biggest conflict in history was officially over. For many people with an interest in World War II, the events of D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, was some of the most significant in the eventual outcome of the war. As this programme draws to a close, we'll review the key points of the Normandy invasion that could have so easily turned the fates against the Allies rather than in their favour. Intelligence and counterintelligence was critical, and although the Allies had the edge, it was a very close-run thing. Convincing the Germans that the attack was coming from Dover into the Pas-de-Calais was vital, and the efforts made to achieve this were meticulous. Even the Hollywood film industry played its part, as technicians were drafted in to create dummy army camps in the Dover area. Also, as the troops got ready for embarkation, the southwest coast of England was virtually shut off, and only military traffic was allowed. Nobody else was permitted to move. Civilians were evacuated from the area, and to this day there are a number of villages that were never restored. A very unfortunate incident that remained top secret throughout the conflict happened at Slapton Sands along England's south coast. American troops were practicing for the Normandy landings when they were spotted by a German U-boat. Many American servicemen lost their lives in the ensuing attack, and the Germans were convinced that they'd wiped out a major part of the Allied invasion force. This all helped when it came to D-Day, keeping the element of surprise on the side of the invading Allied army. When you mention D-Day and the assault on German-occupied Normandy, the first thoughts that spring to mind are of the landing craft and the naval bombardment of the beaches. Yet the contribution of the RAF to Operation Overlord was crucial. Here you see a lovingly restored classic Spitfire. Just watching this beautiful plane in flight, it's easy to understand why it was such a favourite with both pilots and the British public. One of the best places to experience the aircraft of World War II is an aviation heritage centre, such as this wonderful museum at East Kirby in Lincolnshire. And there's another treat in store. Although sadly this grand Lancaster bomber doesn't fly anymore, she does at least make very welcome public appearances to taxi the runway. Just Jane has been painstakingly restored by Fred and Harold Panton, much to the delight of locals and visitors alike. The roar of Just Jane's Merlin engines will bring memories flooding back for those that entrusted their lives to these aircraft back in World War II, whilst giving younger guests a real taste of the past. Both the Spitfires and the Lancaster bombers played a dramatic role in D-Day. It was imperative that not one German aircraft flew over the invasion fleet that stormy night and into the early hours of June the 6th. Nimble and fast in the air, the Spitfires intercepted any Luftwaffe in the area, and remarkably, the battleships and landing craft crossed the channel undetected. Meanwhile, the Lancaster bombers had the daunting task of destroying the German gun emplacements, both along the coast and inland. Watching Just Jane going through her paces here on this quiet Lincolnshire airfield, a quick detour to France and the Lange battery on the outskirts of Bayeux will show precisely what the Lancaster bombers had to face. But the pilots and the aircrew rose to the challenge, and the airmen, the often unsung heroes of D-Day, served king and country above and beyond the call of duty, as they did throughout the entire war. Looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, it truly is miraculous that the D-Day invasion was a success for the Allies. So much could have gone wrong, and with the weather conditions being so terrible, it could be argued that much did. The complex relationships between the Allied commanders and key personnel were far from easy. Eisenhower, as an American, had the unenviable task of controlling both Winston Churchill and Field Marshal Montgomery, whilst bringing out their best qualities. However, it literally was a do-or-die situation, and as you would expect of such truly great statesmen, all differences were put aside and everybody focused on the task ahead, namely ridding the world of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi threat. When the Americans landed off course on Utah Beach, they adapted to the circumstances. At Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers faced a sheer cliff face, but fought onwards and upwards. The brave young men on Omaha came under horrendous enemy fire, but despite terrible losses, fulfilled the task they'd been allocated. The British glider pilots found their targets in pitch darkness, and the Canadian soldiers on Juno Beach refused to be halted or even slowed down by a bombardment of enemy fire. Against all the odds, those who dared won, and it's an achievement that the free world will never forget. Throughout this programme, we've been watching archive footage shot on D-Day. The men who have fallen before your eyes never returned from France, giving their lives as the ultimate sacrifice. For the many people who make the pilgrimage to the Normandy beaches, the cemeteries along the coast are the most poignant memorials to the D-Day landings. The German cemetery at Le Combe is darkly moving, and when you see how many of the conscripted soldiers were boys of just 15 or 16, you realise what an international tragedy this really was. By stark contrast, the final images you'll see today come from the American cemetery high on the cliffs above Omaha Beach. As the flags flutter in the gentle French breeze and the white headstones stand proudly to attention, the legacy of D-Day lives on for all to see. When years earlier Winston Churchill uttered the immortal words, "We shall fight them on the beaches," he could never have known quite what a challenge this would prove to be on D-Day. But his resolute cry of "We shall never surrender" summed up the battle strategy. The successful conclusion of Operation Overlord did mark the beginning of the end of World War II, and the Normandy invasion built slowly but surely upon the advances made on D-Day. For as long as the story of D-Day and the brave souls who gave their all to save the world from tyranny continues to be told, their sacrifice will not have been in vain. Even in the 21st century, this shining example of courage in the face of adversity is a lesson to each and every one of us. The last post will sound, but the memory of D-Day and all it represents will never dim. Rest in peace, comrades in arms. Rest in peace.
on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
For anyone who lived through the Second World War, June the 6th, 1944, emblazoned in history as D-Day, will never be forgotten. It was the beginning of the war's end, and as the Allied forces landed in France on the occupied beaches of Normandy, the tide of history was turning against the tyranny of Adolf Hitler. Today, many thousands of visitors to this beautiful region of France walk in the footsteps of the brave men who gave their lives to liberate this now tranquil landscape. Like many people who come here, retired RAF squadron leader Colin Pomeroy has a very special reason for searching out the D-Day landing sites. His father, then serving with the 1st Battalion of the Dorset Regiment, was one of the soldiers heading the assault force fighting their way up this very beach, codenamed Gold, on that windswept June day so long ago. Returning some years later, father and son were able to share a moving experience, and it is a pilgrimage that Colin has made on a regular basis ever since. As a military historian, the D-Day landings are of particular interest to Colin, making him an ideal guide for this programme, but the fact that he also has such a personal connection with his subject is most definitely an added bonus. When you first encounter the beaches of Normandy, it's hard to imagine the sheltered expanses of golden sand as anything but perfectly peaceful. Known as the Côte de Nacre, which translates as the mother of pearl coast, there's a timeless beauty lingering here that makes it beyond belief that the bloody battles of the D-Day landings took place along this shoreline. However, before setting out on this incredible journey to visit the most significant locations, we do need to pause and enjoy the magnificent view as we set the scene. In the early part of 1944, even Adolf Hitler knew that the invasion of France by the Allied forces was imminent. The fact, therefore, that the D-Day landings took the German commanders somewhat by surprise speaks volumes for the skills of Allied counterintelligence. Choosing the Normandy beaches was a stroke of genius. Hitler had anticipated that the attack would come from the Kent coast to Calais, and the Allies cleverly reinforced this theory. For every reconnaissance flight over Normandy, 2 were flown over the Pas de Calais. The idea that a long-distance sea crossing would be preferable over the shortest hop across to France was preposterous. The weather that June was unseasonably stormy, and an invasion was ruled out by the Germans so emphatically that Field Marshal Edwin Rommel, the man charged with preparing for the expected onslaught, left France to return home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. On the 1st and 5th of June, coded messages were broadcast on the BBC to let the French resistance know that the invasion force was on its way. The lines, "The long sobs of the violins of autumn," and "Wound my heart with a monotonous languor" were used, and although the chief of German intelligence had been tipped off as to the significance of these words, Rommel's staff dismissed the broadcasts because they refused to believe that the Allies would announce their intentions over the radio. However, the German commanders were quite right in one respect. The weather was dreadful. Who in their right minds would contemplate an assault on France in such conditions? For the Allies, preparing for Operation Overlord, as the invasion plan was codenamed, had always been dependent on the meteorological reports. Tide patterns and the state of the moon could at least be predicted, and June the 5th looked ideal. But when the weather turned stormy, the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, reluctantly decided to postpone. The next day was little better, and it was a tough call to make. If not the 6th of June, then it would be at least a fortnight before another attempt could be made. Would the preparations continue to be kept secret? What should happen to the thousands of men already aboard ship? Could they be disembarked, and if so, where to? If ever the cliché "between a rock and a hard place" applied, it was here. It was a risky business indeed, but to all those involved, it was a chance worth taking. And within 2 hours of Eisenhower giving the command, the D-Day invasion convoys slipped silently out into the stormy sea. Our first destination on this tour actually takes us inland to the town of Benneville, at the eastern end of the D-Day beaches. Although we're oversimplifying, the first duties of Operation Overlord called for an airborne attack to secure the rear of the beachheads and neutralise as much of the ordnance targeted on the shoreline as possible. At the eastern end of the designated landing zone lay Caen, which was under heavy German occupation. North of this city there were two strategically important bridges crossing the Caen Canal and the River Orne respectively. It was the task of the British 6th Airborne Division to capture these bridges and preserve them intact, as they would be critical to the eventual breakout from the beachhead. Ever since D-Day, this has been popularly known as Pegasus Bridge, because of the proud flying horse insignia of the British airborne forces who won the first victory of the Normandy campaign. Wooden hawser gliders were towed across the channel by Halifax bomber tugs, and when on target were unhitched to descend silently into the blacked-out French countryside. Although the ground is waterlogged today, when the gliders landed here to set D-Day in motion, this was just an ordinary field. The three lectern-like memorials mark the points where Major John Howard's gliders landed, perfectly on target, enabling a swift capture of Pegasus Bridge, with the element of surprise definitely a bonus for the British soldiers. For those who come to visit Pegasus Bridge today, it's been rather a contentious issue that this is not the wartime original. As the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landings drew near, the Caen authorities announced their intention to replace the bridge. Furious protests followed, as for so many veterans, Pegasus Bridge was a lasting symbol of the bravery and sacrifice made by so many to liberate France and defeat Adolf Hitler. Nevertheless, the bullet-marked original was dismantled in November 1993, with completion of the new bridge in April 94. Fortunately, the design of the bridge is pretty much identical to the old one. It's just a little wider, and so you do get a fairly accurate idea of how this place would have looked in June 1944. While here, it's well worth searching out the Pegasus Bridge Café, which was in fact the first building in France to be liberated from German occupation. A family concern, the Café Gondret, had its own way of coping with the invading Germans. Georges Gondret buried 99 bottles of champagne in the garden, rather than have it consumed by the enemy, but immediately dug it up to celebrate the arrival of the Allied forces. The café quickly became a veritable home from home for thousands of ex-servicemen, with the grateful host continuing to offer them free champagne. It's sad that although the café has remained in family ownership, a modern-day feud between the surviving relatives has resulted in periods of enforced closure. But things are looking positive at the moment for this remarkable building and all the memories it holds of June 1944. Now, just as the British troops were landing on the eastern edge of the Normandy beaches, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions set off from southern England to secure the northwestern perimeter to prevent the German army counterattacking. The weather, as we've already established, was far from ideal, and with poor visibility and high winds, the paratroopers landed as much as 25 miles off course. Field Marshal Rommel had taken measures all across France to flood areas suitable for parachute landings, and also, more famously, he laced entire stretches of land with explosive stakes, the dreaded Rommel asparagus. Carrying heavy packs and ammunition ready to attack the defending Germans, many of the off-course airmen drowned where they fell, swamped under the weight of their own kit. This is the charming town of Sainte-Mère-Église, where Private John Steele, one of the 13,000 men to drop from the skies in the early hours of D-Day, gained lasting fame. The fine church steeple caught the drifting paratrooper, trapping him to dangle helplessly. For 2 long hours, the resourceful man feigned death, but eventually the Germans captured him. It's a story that was immortalised in the 1960s film The Longest Day. And take a closer look at this church when you visit, because a paratrooper still hangs from this famous church spire. But don't be alarmed, it's only a dummy. There are quite a few shops selling plastic replicas for anyone who's interested. The stained glass windows of the church are worthy of note, poignantly depicting scenes from the D-Day landings. Here the Virgin Mary is surrounded by paratroopers, commemorating the events of June 1944 in a most original and vivid way. From Sainte-Mère-Église, it's just a short distance to the first of the beaches we'll be visiting on this tour. Following hot on the heels of the American Airborne Divisions, by 2 a.m. on June the 6th, 30,000 American troops and 3,500 vehicles were in position, ready to land here on Utah Beach with the first light of day. The sea was rough, and nausea caused by the high-rolling waves took its toll. However, the bad weather did have its advantages, as the German E-boats that had been sent out from Cherbourg to patrol this particular area of coastline turned back to port. Preparations had been thorough. Nighttime Allied bombing raids had hammered the coastal batteries under the cover of darkness. At about 5:20 a.m, 300 medium bombers of the 9th US Air Force flew below cloud level to strike the gun emplacements along Utah Beach, whilst shell fire from strategically placed battleships, cruisers and destroyers reinforced the attack from the sea. Consequently, when the assault craft loaded with 2 battalions of the 4th US Infantry Division landed, there was little resistance. 2 D-Day tank squadrons quickly followed, and by 6:30 a.m, progress over the exposed beach to the relative safety of a long, low line of dunes went unhindered, with the exception of fitful spurts of enemy gunfire. The figures from Utah were excellent. There were only 197 Allied casualties, and of the 32 precious tanks to be sent ashore, only 4 were lost. The ease of the Utah landing was due in part to a fortunate navigation error that brought the troops in nearly a mile south of their designated target area. Today, the Leclerc Memorial marks where the US infantry should have landed, and it's well worth stopping off here to investigate the blockhouses and bunkers that fortified this section of beach in 1944, heavily armed and well manned in anticipation of the Allied invasion. However, at the spot where the Americans actually did come ashore, only a single battalion of German soldiers were in a position to defend, and there was little they could do to halt the advancing Allies. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, the former president's eldest son, was in command at Utah, and upon realizing the mistake, is credited with calmly remarking, "We'll start the war from here." There are a striking number of D-Day monuments at this historic beach location, including the milestone marker 00, denoting the beginning of the 4th Division's Liberty Highway, which runs all the way to the German border. Each kilometre of the hard-fought distance is commemorated with a numbered marker, so keep a lookout for these distinctly shaped signposts. The Utah Beach Landing Museum is also a popular destination for veterans of D-Day and tourists alike. The panoramic view of where the American forces landed is magnificent. The beautifully preserved Sherman tank is a real treat, and the prominently displayed landing craft is a stark reminder of how uncomfortable conditions would have been out at sea for the troops embarking on the last leg of their hazardous journey. Make sure you look out for the cafe opposite the museum as well. This is a real mix of old and new, despite being built out of a typical disused German bunker. It's in fact an up-to-the-minute internet cafe, with the very appropriate web address www.leroosevelt.com, in honour of the philosophical Brigadier General who quite literally began the liberation of the Normandy beaches from here. Visiting Utah Beach is an exhilarating experience, and before moving along the coast in a southeasterly direction towards Omaha Beach, the second American landing point, our journey takes us to a very sobering location. This is the German cemetery at Le Combe, where a sad dignity pervades the landscape. For the French authorities, dealing with the many enemy dead was a politically delicate issue, and strict restrictions were put in place. Here the black stone crosses shadow the gravestones, each small square commemorating up to 4 men, and when you look at the dates given, you quickly realise just how young a large proportion of the German army fighting in Normandy was. The majority of those buried here fell between D-Day and August the 20th, 1944, and more than 21,000 German soldiers lie beneath this hallowed ground. It's interesting to note that victims' remains are still being found to this day beneath the Normandy countryside, and any of German origin are brought here to the Lecombe as a final resting place. The scene is dominated by Lecombe's central mound, where 207 unknown soldiers lie alongside 89 identified bodies. Teutonically solemn, the huge black cross at the summit is flanked by two figures who represent parents in mourning, and for present and future generations, whatever their nationality, this is a truly thought-provoking memorial that is far more a celebration of peace than it is a glorification of war. Our next destination leads us back to the sea, where the magnificent Ranger Memorial proudly dominates Point du Hoc, a strategic headland that on D-Day, under German control, appeared to be a significant threat to the Allied forces landing on both Utah and Omaha beaches. A daring plan employed 3 companies of the 2nd Ranger Battalion under the command of Colonel James E. Rudder. Landing on the rocky beach below Point du Hoc's 100-foot cliff face, it was the daunting task of these brave men to climb to the top and destroy the gun battery. The whole operation was certainly perilous, as the German soldiers defending this now crater-marked vantage point had ample opportunity to fire upon the ascending Americans. Of the 225 men who landed at Point du Hoc, 135 were killed, wounded, or missing in action, making for a 60% casualty rate. What made these figures even worse was the fact that Allied intelligence had been misinformed. When the surviving Rangers reached the summit, there were none of the anticipated big guns to be seen. The dreaded ordnance was hidden some distance away, unguarded in an apple orchard, and of course the guns were immediately destroyed. Today, this 30-acre site is cared for by the American Battle Monuments Commission, and apart from the construction of the Ranger Memorial, little else has been touched, giving visitors a dramatic impression of the view that met the Rangers as they scaled the steep cliffs of Point du Hoc all those years ago. If Allied intelligence is criticised with the benefit of hindsight over Point du Hoc, then it can be equally questioned about what happened here at Omaha Beach. It was believed that, although the cliffs were steep, the German soldiers defending the high ground were mainly conscripts with little military skill. But, tragically for the Americans that landed on the beach, this was far from the case. The opposition was fierce, particularly as the German 352nd Infantry Division had the good fortune to have a battalion just completing an anti-invasion exercise in the area. As the Allied landing craft came ashore, the Germans waited until the first ramps were dropped, and only then did the carnage on Omaha Beach begin. This account, prepared by the US War Department's Historical Division, eloquently sums up what happened here as the morning of D-Day dawned. Within 10 minutes of the ramps being lowered, A Company had become inert, leaderless and almost incapable of action. Every officer and sergeant had been killed or wounded. It had become a struggle for survival and rescue. The men in the water pushed wounded men ashore ahead of them, and those who'd reached the sands crawled back into the water, pulling others to land to save them from drowning. In many cases, only to see the rescued men wounded again or to be hit themselves. Within 20 minutes of striking the beach, A Company had ceased to be an assault company and had become a forlorn little rescue party bent upon survival and the saving of lives. Looking up from the beach at Omaha to the scrub-covered steep incline which the few men to survive the landing had to then face, this is without doubt one of the most awesome reminders of the heroism and courage shown by the Allied soldiers not only on D-Day, but throughout the entire course of the war. Of all the D-Day beaches, Omaha was responsible for the heaviest casualties, 5,214 dead, missing and wounded in all. It's therefore extremely fitting that high above Omaha Beach, the beautiful American National Cemetery and Memorial stands in tribute to all the Americans who lost their lives in the battle for Normandy. The bright white marble headstones, either simple crosses or stars of David, are a striking contrast to the dark solemnity of the memorials at Lecombe. Of the 9,286 Americans buried here, 307 are unknown. However, 14,000 bodies were repatriated to the USA at the request of their families. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt is actually buried here, despite surviving the landing on Utah Beach. At the age of 57, he was the oldest officer to land on D-Day, and he died of a heart attack on the 12th of July. Next to Theodore lies the body of his brother, Quentin, an aviator who'd been killed in France during World War I, who was re-interned here to be with his kinsmen when this cemetery was built. There are 32 other pairs of brothers laid to rest side by side, and also a father and son. As our tour moves on, we come to the picturesque harbour at Port-en-Besson, which marks the division between the American beaches of Utah and Omaha and the British beaches of Gold, Juno and Sword. The Vauban Tower, dating back to 1694, managed to survive the bombardments in the aftermath of D-Day, but it is surrounded by many concrete 20th century fortifications that are much less attractive. Although tiny, this port was crucial to the Allied invasion, and by the 14th of June it was handling in excess of 1,000 tons of supplies a day, far more than it had ever done in the centuries before, or, for that matter, in the years since. From Port-en-Besson, it's just a short distance along the coast road to the Lange Battery, which is most definitely worthy of a visit. This significant vantage point was heavily fortified by the Germans, with each of these 4 concrete casements containing a 155mm rapid-firing naval gun. Today the guns are in various states of disrepair, and it's really interesting to explore all along this ridge. The visibility out to sea is spectacular, and it'll not come as any surprise that the Allied forces were keen to quickly neutralise the enemy firepower from Lange. It took HMS Ajax some 7.5 miles out to sea, 20 minutes to silence the guns, and it's been claimed that this first bunker contains the remnants of a gun that took a direct hit right into the barrel. If you look inland from the Lange Battery, you can just make out the spires of Bayeux Cathedral, in a city famous as the home of the Great Tapestry, depicting a certain very successful French invasion back in 1066. Although we're not actually taking in Bayeux as part of our tour, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Cemetery and Memorial here is not to be missed. There are 4,648 graves in this stunning cemetery that has a completely different character again to both its German counterpart at Le Combe and the Normandy American War Cemetery and Memorial. 9 different nationalities are represented, although with 3,935 citizens of the United Kingdom buried on this site, it's actually the largest British World War II cemetery in France. Across the now busy main road stands the Bayeux Memorial to the Missing, which was designed by Philip Hepworth. The names of 1,805 missing Commonwealth service men and women are listed and commemorated in elegant style. The Latin inscription translates as, "We once conquered by William, have now set free the conqueror's land." A very apt remembrance in Bayeux, the first French city to be liberated by the Overlord forces. In 1940, Winston Churchill had promised the people of France that the British would not rest until the Nazi pestilence had been cleansed from Europe. He'd assured the occupied French nation that the morning would come, and on D-Day, the 6th of June, some 4 years later, Churchill's promise was honoured as the 2nd British Army sailed for Normandy. On a beautiful, clear, chill March morning, Colin Pomeroy walks in his father's footsteps along Gold Beach. Today, the only engine sounds to be heard belong to the ancient tractors that local fishermen are using to bring their boats up the beach. It's certainly true that time is a great healer, and although maybe a cliché, life does go on, and nowhere is that more true than here at Gold Beach. But despite the long stretches of golden sand making this a perfect holiday destination, it's impossible to miss the great concrete structures that break the surface of this morning's very calm sea. These enormous reminders of World War II are actually the remains of a major feat of engineering and daring that was instrumental in the success of the D-Day initiative. Moving up to higher ground above the lovely seaside town of Arromanches, overlooking Gold Beach, you get a much better view of the Mulberry Harbour that once stood here. In the planning of Operation Overlord, it was considered essential for both the American and British sectors to have harbours to bring in equipment and supplies as the battle for Normandy progressed. As we've already seen, Port-en-Besson, although a very good place to start, was in no way large enough to service the entire campaign. Consequently, the idea of a floating harbour was conceived, with component parts that could be towed across the English Channel to France in the immediate wake of the D-Day landings. The concept was not only inspired, but also, as all the best ideas are, wonderfully simple. Firstly, a line of old ships would be sunk along all 5 of the invasion beaches, codenamed gooseberries, these ships providing a very basic breakwater. Then a huge semicircle of hollow concrete boxes, codenamed phoenixes, could be towed into place and sunk to form a harbour wall, and floating roadways could be used to link the beaches with the harbour. There were 2 of these harbours, codenamed Mulberries, constructed one, as you see here, at Arromanches, to cater for the British sector, and the other at Omaha Beach, to serve the Americans' needs. Here you see all that's left of the Mulberry Harbour at Omaha, but it wasn't the Germans who were responsible for its destruction. Some 13 days after D-Day, the weather proved to be one of the Allies' major enemies. A terrific northeasterly storm smashed this mulberry to smithereens, and the gales that ensued caused more damage in 3 days than the Germans had managed in 2 weeks. Although the mulberry at Arromanches, nicknamed Port Winston, was battered by the storm, it remained intact, so what little could be salvaged from Omaha was taken to reinforce it. This was a setback, of course, only having 1 mulberry rather than the planned 2, but in the circumstances, the Allies counted themselves fortunate that the Arromanches mulberry had survived. Back down on Gold Beach, Colin has been able to find the exact spot where his father and his regiment, the Dorsets, came ashore on the morning of D-Day. Following the track up off the beach at this point is a rather pleasant detour for him, as one of the first roads that you come to is actually called Rue the Dorset Regiment, named in honour of the regiment that Colin's father had been so proud to be part of. Other roads commemorate the Hampshires and the Devonshires, and it's well worth looking out for the many road names and memorials of the D-Day landings that are certainly plentiful all along this beautiful Normandy coastline. Beyond Gold Beach, we next find Juno, where the Canadian 3rd Division had been selected to lead the assault. For many people, the images filmed on D-Day at this particular location are some of the most evocative pictures from this entire campaign, treasured by war archivists the world over. It's an interesting fact that there were at least 50 film crews recording the events of the D-Day landings, and the footage acquired can be both harrowing and uplifting by equal measure. Here you see the Canadian soldiers preparing to disembark as the ramps of the landing craft are dropped. Houses appear along the beachfront, and although the scene has of course changed in the years since D-Day, it is still possible to find the exact spot where these pictures were taken. Only the smaller of the two houses remains, still bearing the name Les Hirondelles, translated as the Swallows, tracked down for certain by the single chimney. It's quite remarkable that today we can follow in the footsteps of the Canadians as they came ashore, enabling us to step back in time and see the view that greeted them on that memorable morning. All is now peaceful, and as a rider enjoys his seaside gallop, the tranquility of this beautiful location weaves its nostalgic magic for present-day visitors and future generations, who will undoubtedly search out the D-Day landing beaches for themselves. There's no great distance between Juno and Sword Beach. By the time you reach this sector, there's little along the beach to distinguish Sword to any great degree. However, there's a fascinating story told here of bravery in the face of adversity, typical of the great British spirit that even in the darkest days of World War II refused to be crushed. Sword Beach was heavily mined and had the most concentrated landing area of all the beaches, with a 3-mile long by half-mile deep targeted shore zone. This factor, combined with a swift incoming tide on the morning of the 6th of June, meant there was considerable overcrowding as men and machinery came ashore. In such a bottleneck, casualties were high, with particularly accurate German artillery fire, and it was here, in these difficult and life-threatening conditions, that Piper Bill Millin of Lord Lovat's 1st Special Service distinguished himself in style. Fully kilted and armed with his bagpipes, Piper Millin leapt waist-deep into the water and regaled the advancing Allied troops with a rendition of Highland Laddie. From his own accounts, the beach was littered with burning tanks and fallen men, their bodies being washed on and off the beach with the ebb and flow of the tide. Still, the brave Piper played on, marching up and down the shoreline until his comrades advanced off the beach to continue their liberation of the French countryside. In fact, Piper Millin was still playing his bagpipes when Lord Lovat's troops relieved Pegasus Bridge. as our journey uncovering the history of the D-Day landing beaches comes to an end, the liberation of France and the Allied victory in World War II can be described as still being in its early stages. Cherbourg, the once great port at the northwestern end of the American landing beaches, was captured on the 27th of June in ruins. Caen, at the British eastern edge of the beaches, eventually fell to the Allies on the 9th of July, and break out from the beachhead towards the French capital Paris, and eventual victory forged ever onwards. By September the 1st, 1944, the battle for Normandy was over. This remarkable region of France had been liberated, and its inhabitants were free to rebuild their decimated towns and cities, and their shattered lives. Our last destination on this tour takes us to the Merville Battery, a short distance north of Caen. This remarkable 40-acre site is a prime example of the sympathetic preservation that you'll find all over Normandy. Concrete remnants of the occupation, and one of the 4 gun casements has been transformed into a fascinating museum. Much of the material on display is of a touchingly personal nature, including letters and photographs representing all sides of the conflict. Although there's none of the sombre dignity of the German cemetery at Le Combe, or the bright shining splendour of the American cemetery high above Omaha Beach, this place is every bit a memorial to those who lost their lives in the fight for freedom. When you read the words of a French farmer's wife whose husband was shot by the Germans for allowing Allied airmen to shelter in their barn, the real implications of the battle for Normandy are made starkly clear, in a way that can be understood by every man, woman and child who comes here. Ironically, the capture of the Merville Battery was not one of the Allies' slickest operations. For Major Terence Otway and the 9th Parachute Battalion that he commanded, the strategy employed at Merville was overcomplicated and proved to be impractical. A coordinated attack by RAF Lancaster bombers failed to take out the guns, and the man-to-man combat that was required to overpower the Germans was indeed costly. 70 men were killed or wounded, reducing the battalion by almost half, leaving 80 paratroopers to complete the task. However, despite little at Merville going to plan, the bravery and resourcefulness of Major Otway and his men certainly saved the day, and they are all remembered as heroes. It's often been said that the difference between the Allied troops and their German counterparts was most evident when the men needed to think for themselves. Hitler and his commanders' dictatorial style of leadership left little room for initiative, and events such as the storming of the Merville Battery, when the Allied soldiers were literally forced to think on their feet, turned the tide of the war, and more importantly, the course of history. And so our story comes to a very thought-provoking close. Hopefully, this tour of the D-Day landing beaches, devised by squadron leader Colin Pomeroy, has captured the true atmosphere of a June morning back in 1944 that significantly affected the lives of us all. Normandy today has much to teach its many visitors, and it truly has been a privilege to walk in the footsteps of the brave souls who risked everything to free France from tyranny and ensure that for all mankind the world could be a better place.